The Committee on Education and Labor will come to order for the purposes of conducting this hearing on child abuse, deceptive marketing by residential programs for teens. Last October, this committee heard from the parents of 3 children who died in private residential programs as a result of abuse and neglect they experienced at the hands of staff members. These stories these parents told left everyone in this room stunned, heartbroken, and angry. Bob Bacon testified program staff members mocked his son Aaron when the 16-year-old boy asked for medical help, calling him a faker. For weeks, the staff deprived Aaron of adequate food and water, even when his weight loss became frighteningly apparent. Cynthia Harvey told the committee of a program staff members waited 45 minutes before summoning appropriate medical care for her daughter Erica, who had collapsed and was having difficult breathing. Paul Lewis testified that program staff members ignored his son Ryan's obvious signs of emotional distress, denying him the psychiatric care that could have saved his life. In each of these cases, it was clear from the parents' testimony that the deaths of their children were preventable. Untrained, uncaring staff, reckless management, irresponsible operating practices permitted these horrible tragedies to occur. Sadly, the deaths of Aaron, Erica, and Ryan are not isolated cases. The Government Accountability Office found thousands of allegations of abuse and neglect in private residential homes for teens between 1990 and 2007. The abuses included staff members forcing members to remain in so-called stress positions for hours at a time, to undergo extreme physical exertion without food, water, or rest, and to eat their own vomit. The purpose of today's hearings is to gain a better overall understanding of the industry in which these types of abuses have been allowed in many cases to continue almost unchecked. Specifically, we will learn more about where these programs operate, the loose patchwork of state laws that govern them, and how they market themselves to parents. We will also discuss legislation that Congresswoman McCarthy and I have introduced to keep kids safe in these residential programs. Residential programs for teens, which come in a variety of forms, including therapeutic boarding schools, wilderness camps, boot camps, and behavior modification facilities, have sprung up in greater numbers since the 1990s. As we will hear today, a number of these programs use deceptive marketing practices to appeal to parents. They claim to be subject of independent inspections that never happen. They claim to offer services that don't, like schooling and transferable education credits. They assure parents that health insurance will cover the cost of their service, when in reality it won't. Programs are aided by these deceptions by their relationships with ancillary service providers like referral services. While referral services purport to offer independent advice to parents about which programs would be best for their children, the truth is that at least some of the referral services operate with significant conflicts of interest. This tangled web of deception, fraud, and conflicts of interest makes it extremely difficult for parents to judge whether any of these programs offer a safe, professional, high-quality environment for their children. We know that many of these programs and many people around the country who are committed to helping improve the lives of young people who do good work every day, but it is difficult for parents to tell the good programs from the bad, and that difference can be lethal. Making matters worse, some of these programs operate free of minimum standards of care. It is estimated that hundreds of programs operate nationwide with anywhere from no regulation whatsoever to some regulation. Even the information that states collect on many of these programs is limited. Indeed, a survey conducted by the GAO, state agencies in 45 states could not say whether or not a death had occurred at exclusively private residential programs for teens in 2006. The legislation that Congresswoman McCarthy and I have introduced will end the federal government's longstanding failure to address this nightmare of abuse and neglect. Our goal of this legislation is simple. We want to keep the children safe. This legislation will require the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to establish minimum standards that all programs must meet, including prohibitions on physical and mental abuse of children and requirements that programs provide children with adequate food, water, and medical care. These standards will also include new training requirements for program staff members, including how to identify and report child abuse. The legislation will require Health and Human Services to set up a hotline for people to call to report abuse at these programs. It will also require Health and Human Services to create a website with information about each program so that parents can look to see if substantiated cases of abuse have occurred at the programs they are considering for their kids. The legislation will require Health and Human Services to enforce these standards by inspecting program facilities, and when there is a violation, by issuing civil penalties up to $50,000 per violation. Within 3 years, the legislation would call upon the states to take up this role of setting standards and enforcing them. We have an obligation to keep kids safe no matter what the settings they are in, and this legislation would take the first steps toward finally ending the horrific abuses that have gone on for far too long in some of these private residential programs for teens. We must treat this issue with the urgency it demands by acting on this legislation quickly. Individuals who have themselves lived through this abuse are at in the hearing room today, as are family members of abuse victims. I want to thank all of them for being here to remind us why this issue is so important, and I want to thank our witnesses. We appreciate that you took the time to be with us today, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. At this point, I recognize Congressman McKeon from California, who is the senior Republican on the committee, and then we'll turn to the panel of witnesses for your testimony. Congressman McKeon.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and good morning. We're here today for our second hearing on residential treatment facilities for teens. I know I speak for all my colleagues when I say that I was deeply troubled by the testimony we heard last year. Many of these facilities have been established to serve children who are deeply troubled. Whether they are suffering from drug addiction or severe emotional or behavioral problems, many of the youth who enter these facilities are placed there by parents as a last resort. Yet no parent, no matter how serious the troubles their child may face, would knowingly send their child to a place where they may be abused or neglected. Today's hearing builds on our findings from last year by examining the marketing practices of residential treatment facilities. Once again, I expect we will hear of some worst-case scenarios in which parents may have been deliberately misled. Our witness panel also includes former participants in these types of programs. I want to take a moment to thank these witnesses for offering their testimony today, when I know they've faced some very difficult experiences. At the outset of today's hearings, I think it's important that we ask the same questions that we asked last year. How pervasive are these problems? What safeguards are in place to protect against them? And what are the best practices in the industry so that we can encourage broader adoption of their practices? The facilities we're examining today receive no federal funding under the juvenile justice programs this committee has been working to reform over the past year. Nonetheless, I understand that Chairman Miller has introduced legislation that would establish a federal regulatory structure and mandate state regulatory systems. I'm eager to work with him on our shared effort to stem instances of neglect, abuse, and death. At the same time, we must be mindful of the ramifications of any new federal intervention in order to ensure these issues are addressed in the best, most appropriate, and most effective possible manner. The question of the scope of the problem will be important as we consider the possibility of federal legislation. Although even one instance of child abuse and neglect is too many, we cannot provide an effective response until we understand whether the problems are a few isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern. We also need to understand how these facilities are being regulated under state and local laws. The last thing we hope to do is create a patchwork of confusing regulations that would undercut our ability or the ability of states to protect young people and their families. One area I think deserves greater attention in our deliberations is the question of what works. We are right to focus on cases where children have been harmed or parents have been misled. But the picture would be incomplete without also examining the stories of those young people who have been able to turn their lives around thanks to this type of intervention. Mr. Chairman, I request that 2 pieces of testimony be included in the record in order to broaden and enlighten the discussion. This testimony comes from 2 young women who had positive, life-changing experiences at residential treatment facilities.
Without objection, so it may be made part of the record.
Once again, I want to thank Chairman Miller for his leadership on this issue, and I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here to explore this important issue. I expect that we will proceed thoughtfully, cautiously, and deliberately on this issue in the coming months in an effort to ensure youth and their families are protected. And I yield back.
Thank you. Chair notices the presence of a quorum, and before introducing our witnesses, let me briefly lay out how we will proceed in today's hearings. Because of the importance of this issue, I'm extend the 5-minute rule for myself and Mr. McKean. Following the witnesses' testimony, we will each have 15 minutes apiece for questioning. It is our intention to yield 5 minutes of our time to the chairwoman and senior Republican of the Subcommittee on Healthy Families and Communities, Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Platts. Following the expiration of the extended questioning, all of the members will be recognized for five minutes. And with that, let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness will be Mr. Gregory Coots, who is currently the Managing Director of GAO's Forensic Audits and Special Investigation Unit. Mr. Coots has testified and written investigative reports about federal government's handling of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, military pay problems, the Department of Defense, and smuggling of nuclear materials across our nation's borders, among other important issues. He is accompanied by Andy O'Connell, the Assistant Director of Investigations at GAO. Catherine Whitehead is a former program participant at Mission Mountain School, where she spent 18 months as a teenager. She currently works for the Mental Health Association of New York City's Coordinated Children's Services Initiative, working toward keeping struggling youth in their communities. Ms. Whitehead is also a co-founder of the Community Alliance for the Ethical Treatment of Youth, an advocacy organization whose mission is ending human rights abuses of youth in residential programs. John Martin Crawford is a former program participant at the Family Foundation School, where he spent almost 2 years as a teenager. John is currently working towards a double master's in English and secondary education, and is also working with the Community Alliance for Ethical Treatment of Youth, hoping to shed light on the troubled teen industry. Dr. Christopher Balanci is the board-certified child, adolescent, adult psychiatrist who has worked in residential treatment and school consultation since completing his child psychiatry training at McLean Hospital in 1993. He is currently the medical director and senior clinical consultant at Walker in Needham, Massachusetts, working with children experiencing severe emotional and behavioral disorders secondary to major mental illnesses, trauma, and developmental disorders. Dr. Balanci is on the Mental Health Advisory Board of the Child Welfare League, and is a board member of the American Association of Children's Residential Centers. Kay Brown is the director of GAO's Education, Workforce, and Income Security Team, and more than 30 years' experience in GAO. She is responsible for GAO's work related to child welfare, child support, domestic nutrition assistance, among other social programs. Throughout her career at the GAO, Ms. Brown has managed projects that focused on improving governmental performance in services to children and families, disability and retirement, benefit delivery, and customer service and program integrity. She is accompanied by Cindy Ayers, Assistant Director for Education, Workforce, and Income Security at the GAO. And Mr. Coots, we'll begin with you, and I believe under our arrangements you will be allowed 10 minutes. As you know, there will be an orange light when there's 1 minute left, and then a green light. We hope that you'll be able to wrap up your testimony, but we clearly want you to be able to complete your thoughts in a coherent fashion. Welcome to the committee, and thank you for your work.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss residential programs for troubled youth. Last year I testified that negligent practices contributed to the death and abuse of troubled youth. Today's testimony responds to your request that we continue our work in this area. My testimony has two parts. First, I will discuss cases of death and abuse. Second, I will discuss industry marketing practices. I will also play excerpts from telephone calls we made to certain programs while posing as fictitious parents with troubled youth. First, we took an in-depth look at 8 cases of youth that died or were allegedly abused at private programs. It is important to note that we did not evaluate the benefits of these programs. In addition, the results of these case studies cannot be projected to all programs. For these cases, we found that untrained staff and ineffective management contributed to the death and abuse of youth. Human restraint also played a key role in several cases. The following examples will provide more detail. First, one group became lost and spent several additional hours hiking when the reported heat index outside was 120 degrees. A 14-year-old boy weighing 250 pounds had problems breathing but was encouraged by the staff to continue. When he returned to the camp, he collapsed against a tree and fell to the ground. Staff believed that he was faking it until he vomited, became unresponsive, and ultimately died. A 17-year-old male jumped off of a building in a suicide attempt and severely broke his left arm with the bone exposed. Despite this severe wound, the boy was punched, slammed against walls, and rolled in the dirt. He was beaten so severely that he forgot who he was and he became unconscious. These beatings continued for 2 weeks before he was finally given medical treatment. A 16-year-old boy having trouble breathing and walking was tortured and humiliated for days. One staff told the boy that he deserved an Academy Award for faking it. He died later that day. An autopsy report for this boy showed 71 contusions and abrasions from head to toe. Another 16-year-old boy with asthma was placed in a face-down restraint by 3 staff members before he died. Another boy was restrained more than 250 times, including 2 times for more than 12 hours each. A 12-year-old boy weighing 87 pounds was placed in a face-down restraint with a staff lying on top of him until he died. And a staffer referred to as the drill instructor trained his pit bull to bite people in the crotch on command. A 17-year-old boy experienced this painful abuse. Other kids in these and other programs also experienced disturbing abuse. For example, boys at one boot camp were required to stand with bags over their head and a hangman's noose around their neck. The rope on this noose was tightened to simulate a hanging. The individual responsible for this told officers that this was an appropriate form of discipline. Another boy was forced to lie face down on a red anthill and was not allowed to brush the ants off of his face or his body. In a separate incident, this boy was required to lie on his stomach for 10 hours. He was only allowed to get up to vomit, and then he was required to clean up his vomit before he got down on the ground again. And finally, the poster board shows the picture of a horse in Canada. This horse was starved, as you can see, by the protruding rib cage. Neglect also resulted in the problems with the hoof that you see on the picture. You're probably wondering what this has to do with today's hearing. Here's the interesting answer to that question. This horse belonged to the owner of one of our case study programs. This owner was convicted in Canada for cruelty to 39 horses and 7 golden retrievers. Although he received a lifetime ban from taking care of animals in Canada, he was allowed to take care of teenagers here in the United States. And the results should not be surprising. He and his wife were cited in Utah for, among many things, use of profane language to humiliate youth, improper seclusion, and rat infestation. Let me move on to my second point of my testimony here. Posing as fictitious parents with troubled teenagers, we called a number of programs and referral services to see what they would tell us. What we found were examples of deceptive and other questionable marketing practices. Let me describe a few of these cases for you. First, one program told our fictitious parent that they must apply to have their child admitted to the program. Although we never actually applied, the poster board on my right shows that our fictitious child, Devin, was approved for admission to this program. One fictitious parent was also told that membership in a trade association was like a good housekeeping seal of approval. One program went so far as to tell us that site inspections were performed by this association. The reality is that this association simply collects dues but does no due diligence of any programs. And one referral service told our fictitious parent that the boot camp they recommended feeds the child a whole grain diet, and that along with exercise and rest, and I quote, the bipolar, the depression, those kinds of things, they just go away after a while. Our fictitious parents heard other deceptive and questionable information during our undercover calls, issues related to taxes, reimbursement of health insurance, and education provided. One explanation for these shady marketing practices relates back to the root cause of many problems: money. These programs aren't cheap. Costs for the programs that we called ranged from $2,800 per month to over $13,000 per month. In conclusion, we as a country judge other countries harshly for their human rights violations. Yet at the same time, we found torture and abuse of youth across the United States. I can't tell you how widespread this problem is, but if the only horror stories are the ones that I have described for you, then isn't that enough? Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you for your continued oversight of this matter. We support the committee's efforts to put a framework of oversight and control in place over these programs. Although the youth we're talking about today are troubled, that shouldn't be an excuse for anybody to torture and abuse them. I now want to play the excerpts I mentioned at the beginning of my statement here of some of the phone calls we made as posing as fictitious parents with troubled youth. And what you will see on the screen, assuming it works, is the transcriptions of these conversations on the monitor while you listen.
The way I would like for you to explain it to her so she doesn't just freak out is I want you to tell her it's a college prep boarding school that focuses on the emotional needs of a teenager. If she thinks that you want to send her daughter to a place where there are drug addicts and people that are all screwed up, she will look at you and say, no way. So the way you approach her is like I just said. What I would do, I can give you the code for the Internal Revenue right now. It's 213.
Okay, what is that? What does that mean? I don't know what 213 is.
Well, what it does, it means it's a code you use in order to deduct the amount of money. You know, whether you take a loan or you pay for it yourself, it is tax deductible.
It is tax deductible, okay.
And another thing is what they found is that they feed the child a whole grain diet. There's not any sugars, there's no caffeine, anything like that. And then with getting the exercise and with getting plenty of rest, we find that these kind of issues go away. The bipolar, the depression, those kind of things. They just go away after a while.
And it's pretty expensive. I mean, you can look at maps up on the web too, but it's pretty expensive.
Do they come out and do inspections or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for their donation, they get a tax benefit. And then they can suggest that their donations be applied to the account of a particular student, not by saying the student's name, because we don't want it to be, well, we try to stay within, we stay within the laws of the IRS. We can't do a pass-through donation. The suggested funds program where they can suggest that the funds go to a particular code number or student ID number when they calculate, how much has come in assigned by a code number so that we can send that money to the school particular child it was assigned to.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for being generous with my time, and that ends my statement.
Thank you. Ms. Whitehead. Welcome again. You'll be given 5 minutes, and at some point there will be an orange light in front of you, and that'll give you an idea that there's about a minute. But again, we want you to complete your thoughts in the manner that you're comfortable with. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKeon, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today. I appreciate your leadership and efforts to help protect youth from abuse and neglect by convening this hearing. I'm here to share the tragic experience of myself and family at an unregulated facility in Montana called Mission Mountain School, a NATSAP member program where the headmaster, John Mercer, served on the board of directors for several years. I will also speak on behalf of a youth survivor advocacy group, the Community Alliance for the Ethical Treatment of Youth, to the general concerns of youth placed in private residential care. At the age of 13, I was diagnosed with chronic depression following a suicide attempt and hospitalized at a local psychiatric hospital. When I was discharged, lacking any community-based support, my family sought to identify services outside of my community and found Mission Mountain School at the recommendation of a hired educational consultant. Mission Mountain School held great promise, as it was sold to us as a small, family-like therapeutic environment for girls ages 12 to 18 with above-average intelligence. I packed my treasured belongings, reminders of home, and my mom and I flew out to Montana. I felt hopeful that maybe this special school for kids like me would help, as they claimed to have the ability to treat any myriad of serious psychiatric issues such as bipolar disorder, eating disorder, and depression. Sadly, this couldn't be further from the truth. Upon arrival, I quickly encountered the punitive and invasive interventions which would come to define my 18 months at Mission Mountain School. My mom left me shortly after we had arrived, and most of my belongings were taken from me. I never received any explanation of the rules of the program, though the rules quickly took shape during the series of group sessions held daily. Everyone was called out in group when they first arrived. Every infraction was framed as an act of dishonesty. We were all labeled liars and manipulators upon arrival. Often there were punishments when we were thought to have been dishonest, euphemistically called consequences. Consequence always involved some type of physical punishment, forced labor, exercise, labor such as ice picking, rock picking, and chopping wood. More serious rule breaking would result in what was called an intervention, which was work crew all day long with breaks only during group, chores, and mealtime. There were personal interventions and group interventions. Sometimes the group was placed on interventions which would last weeks, if not months. And during this time, no contact was allowed with the outside world, in contrast to our already limited, monitored, and censored contact under usual conditions. It was generally understood that we're being exhausted for the purpose of making us more truthful, whatever that meant to those in charge. Exercise was a rigorous daily requirement. Slowing down from exhaustion only resulted in more exercise or getting yelled at. Staff would often use profanity. I was not allowed to speak with my family for months after I arrived, and calls thereafter were monitored. Any criticisms were labeled as manipulative, and my phone call was promptly disconnected, followed by punishment. The most powerful figure at the facility was a headmaster with no formal training in mental health, and whose group therapy sessions were particularly bizarre and frightening. He was often confrontational or would smirk and laugh. He would attempt to unearth repressed memories and encourage regressive states. I recall that on multiple occasions, my friends speaking as if they were toddlers, recounting alleged instances of abuse. Hours would be spent with girls reliving their traumatic experiences at the unqualified hands of the staff. Intensive group sessions sometimes lasted all night. Bathroom use was prohibited. Any allegations of abuse discussed in group therapy were never reported by staff to proper authorities. Because all the founders were members of AA, it seemed to them that everyone was an addict of sorts. I was deemed an alcoholic and a sex addict. A close friend was deemed a sex addict. She had never had sex in her life and denied the claim. As a result, staff forced her to carry 6 large rocks on her back at all times for several months, naming them issues like sexual abuse, sex addiction, causing bruising along her spine. At other times, inappropriate and humiliating interventions were used, such as forbidding youth from talking for several weeks, forcing youth to wear gloves because it was thought they were masturbating, or tying 2 girls together because they didn't get along. When I got caught with a plan to run away, I was placed on a personal intervention where I had to rock pick for a week, 8 to 10 hours a day, and at one point dropped off 25 miles from school and forced to hike back. This was all done in the name of therapy. Education was nearly non-existent, claims of illness taken as manipulative. We had no access to advocates, no rights whatsoever. Then one day, 18 months later, I was told I was to be discharged. I had visited home maybe twice while there and was ever more grossly ill-prepared to function in the world. My nights were filled with a reoccurring nightmare of being chased by the founders and brought back to the facility, despite protests that I was healthy now. In the end, all Mission Mountain School gave me was more confusion, increased anxiety and depression, and made social functioning after discharge ever more difficult. The work I've done since then, I anticipate, will speak to the broad pattern of atrocities Dr. Pinto commented on in her testimony at the hearings in October 2007. As co-founder and executive director of the Community Alliance for the Ethical Treatment of Youth, I have heard from over 1,000 survivors and understand that in most instances, parents remain unaware of the abuse their children have experienced and often firmly believe the program saved their child's life. To me, this is the saddest repercussion of these facilities. At once, not only is the trust between parent and child broken, but the truth is further hidden behind the facade promulgated by deceived parents. What I'm hoping to convey...
I'm going to ask you to wrap up, if you might.
What I'm hoping to convey today through my testimony is that numerous residential facilities that are in operation are stripping youth of their basic human rights to dignity, respect, to least restrictive care, appropriate mental health treatment, to education and parental contact, to freedom of thought and opinion, and ultimately to freedom from censorship and torture. The legitimate practice of therapeutic intervention is being injected with a perverse form of social control, including inhumane treatment practices which defy the ethical principles upheld by peer-reviewed mental health practices. I believe this bill to be a promising and important first step in curbing such draconian methodology and applaud Chairman Miller for introducing the first piece of comprehensive legislation to that end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Martin Crawford.
First, I would like to thank the chairman and the committee for the opportunity to present my side of this story. After watching the hearing back in October, I was truly inspired by the clear case of morality that brought together both sides of the aisle on this discussion. We've been called noisy complainers, and we've been called manipulating troublemakers, but after 10 years, I finally have my chance to speak. My name's John Martin Crawford, and I was locked up in the NATSAP-affiliated program, the Family Foundation School in Hancock, New York, from 95 to 97. My life at home was anything but stable, causing me to seek my own release from it all. I created a persona for myself, the troublemaker at school, always looking for attention I didn't get at home. I was involved in drugs by the age of 13. I was lost, constantly in fights, legal run-ins, and more. My parents were at wit's end. My only release was my music, my writing, and my skateboarding. After being expelled from public school and one private school for marijuana use and writing an underground newspaper, my parents were told to send me to the family shortly thereafter, thinking it would give me what I needed. Once I arrived at the family, I knew I was there until I was 18. I went through what seems like the ritualistic stripping of identity almost all of us survivors faced. I was stripped, my clothes were taken and thrown away, my music, my art, my skateboard, all destroyed. What I didn't have with me, my parents were told to destroy as well. I was left with only a letter from my mother for the next 3 months. I've been to some inpatient settings before, but this one was different. Other places allowed phone calls, mail, peer communication. Here I wasn't even allowed to call home the first few months. Even after that, I only got one phone call home a week, nothing more, no access to CPS. Here I was only allowed to talk to staff and kids that had been there more than 6 months. I was told I was denying the extent of my drug use, and I was confused as to just how I would get better enough to see my family. I sat, watched, and learned to play the game of lies necessary to get privileges and eventually get out. I was lucky and figured these rules out quickly enough not to endure what I saw many kids endure, but I witnessed it all. including staff punching students in the face while restraining, not once, but several times. Typical restraint procedures were wrapping kids up in duct tape and blankets. Kids were not let out of this wrap, even to use the bathroom for feminine hygiene or just to move around a little bit and extend their limbs. Restraints were not only done by faculty, but students as well. Usually this was even more brutal and was often done in front of all other students to show what will happen if you act out. Kids were forced to eat food they were allergic to and keep eating even if vomiting as a result. We were forced to attend daily religious services and AA meetings and share personal stories with the outside world. Kids as young as 12 being taken out of school to carry out pointless manual labor, such as shovel manure, carry wheelbarrows of rocks, sweeping the roof, shoveling, numerous things for days on end. When kids tried to run away, it was again not only staff, but students told to chase, tackle, restrain, and bring them back. Many things were heard from staff, berating kids with high levels of verbal abuse, often of a highly derogatory and sexual nature, at times regarding sexual orientation. An admitted sex addict was one of the high-up faculty and counselors, as well as a dorm monitor living above the boys' dorm. The rules I learned to avoid many of these problems were as follows. I made up a horrible past to cure myself of. Our moral inventory was nearly always fabricated to make our problems seem worse and the program seem like salvation. Tell on yourself and your peers for things that you may have never done to give the illusion that you're getting better and working the program. If you have certain gifts, you can find a way to skate by. For me, I was their golden boy with my pen, and at my graduation speech, as well as for others, our speeches were used as propaganda as part of the family day for all the parents to hear their message of goodwill. Under no circumstances were we to tell our parents or prospective parents the truth about what we saw. I was fortunate enough to go home after a while, but I quickly learned that if I told my parents the truth about what I saw, I would only be explained as a manipulation and lose more privileges. While I had been fortunate enough to miss out on these horrors personally, I gave many tours to prospective parents, always omitting the details of restraints, punishments, and any lack of communication against the abuses that took place. As a dorm leader, I was told to wake up one of the kids in my dorm with the lamp that only had a floodlight as a bulb, burning his retinas. I participated in the restraining and took part in the barrage of verbal attacks, just as did many of my peers. I'm not proud of this, but we had no choice. If we did not conform, we were being negative and subjected to the same treatment and lack of privileges as everyone else. Once I left, I saw that I was now in the real world with real problems again, and the school had never helped me with those problems. After nightmares of the family led to a relapse, I was soon out of Vassar College and into the military. The training in the military, although viewed by some to be harsh, was a cakewalk compared to the hell endured at the family school. My trust issues were never resolved after leaving the family, and the nightmares remained. Ultimately, these psychological issues and flashbacks led to the need for my discharge from the Army, something I regret to this day. For years, I thought all this was my fault. While the nightmares and anxiety never wore off, getting high at least made it go away again. I will not blame others for my choices or my mistakes. I take responsibility for those. What I blame the family for is stripping me of my childhood. I still have nightmares of being locked up and told I'm ruining my life. I still read their monthly paper of lies and get nauseous remembering what we witnessed. The only thing I can say to temper my disdain for these types of schools, or at least for the family, is this. While the programs, as they are, have little positive effect long term, I do believe that kids in my position need some sort of help. I believe there can be a safe solution, as some staff are genuinely decent and caring people. We need oversight and regulation of these facilities with swift and severe penalties for those who stray from the standards. What must be remembered through all of this is that these success stories that these places put out tend to fall in the 1 to 2 year range after leaving such program and are usually the opinions of parents. A true statistic, of the 25 kids from my graduation class and the one prior to mine, maybe 4 remain sober. While many can now say they lived successful lives, it came anywhere between 5 and 10 years after leaving the program and figuring out life on their own with psychiatric help. Unfortunately, this cannot be said for all. The programs are quick to take credit for a successful story and are just as fast to claim that anyone that doesn't make it just didn't work the program. The truth, the nightmares and psychological scars of being dragged from your home to a place in the middle of nowhere, restrained in blankets and duct tape, assaulted verbally and physically, those scars and that trauma never go away. For my friends who have since died from suicide because of the nightmares, or those who still suffer the nightmares, our time and our voice will not be in vain. There comes a time for every man to make amends and right their wrongs. This is a lesson all these programs preach, and it's a lesson they should now follow.
Thank you. Dr. Belancy?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I am pleased to be here in support of your proposed legislation, the Stop Child Abuse in Residential Treatment Programs for Teens Act of 2008. As a child and adolescent psychiatrist who dedicates his career to the treatment of youth with mental health disorders, I'm frankly horrified to hear about these accounts of blatant abuse in the name of treatment or therapy. Nothing that I learned in medical school or my clinical training could ever justify such treatment. The behavioral interventions you have heard described have no role in the appropriate treatment of mental or substance abuse disorders. As you're hearing, this is trauma-inducing and not trauma treatment. Let me start by saying that treatment for a child or adolescent with serious emotional disturbance should be in the least restrictive environment, and preferably with their family. However, there are many children that cannot effectively be treated and managed in a home or community environment safely and need more acute, intensive treatment. I'm here today to talk about Walker and the specific needs of children and adolescents being treated in residential centers. Walker is licensed in Massachusetts through our state's Early Education and Care Agency. As an accredited school, we are also approved by our State Department of Education. We are accredited by the Council on Accreditation, a national accrediting body originally affiliated with the Child Welfare League of America. Our licensing and accrediting agencies all require frequent renewal and on-site visits by representatives of these various regulatory bodies. We also adhere to reporting requirements that are consistent with those proposed in your legislation. EEC has clear guidelines for adherence to civil rights that would prohibit restriction of access to mail, family visits, or phone calls. We do not utilize wilderness programming or boot camp experiences. We would never allow other children to restrain other children. Our staff undergoes a minimum of 2 weeks of pre-service training, including instruction in Cornell University's Therapeutic Crisis Intervention, with a focus on de-escalation strategies and techniques that are individualized to the unique strengths and needs of the children we work with. Staff is cleared by the Massachusetts criminal records search process before they are allowed unsupervised contact with children. During orientation, staff also receives training regarding mandated reporting laws, first aid, and CPR. Walker has explicit policies outlining unacceptable forms of discipline consistent with those in your proposed legislation that would never allow the sorts of treatment that you're hearing described today. We also have clear policies regarding notification of adverse outcomes, both to parents and guardians, as well as our State Child Protective Service, our licensor, and funding and referral sources. We strive for transparency in our work and view parents as essential allies in the complex treatment of children. We have an open campus and invite and encourage parents to visit and be an active part of the treatment milieu. Increasingly, we have been serving children and families in their homes, schools, and communities. We actively partner with our state's child welfare and mental health departments in advancing best practice principles and provide consultation and program review and development to over 35 school districts in Massachusetts. We take our commitment to family-driven practice seriously, and in the last year have hired our first parent liaison coordinator, who was a parent of a child formerly in residential care at Walker. For over 5 years, we have had a current parent serving as a voting member of our board of directors. We also have an active parent council and run parent support groups for all interested families. I work directly with most of the children served in our residential program, providing psychiatric treatment. It is against my ethical and licensing requirements to make a medication change without first discussing the risks and benefits of the proposed treatment and obtaining informed consent. In this regard, I'm frankly concerned that your legislation may not go far enough, as it calls for notification to parents within 24 hours of a medication change after that change has already been made, when it's quite clear standards of ethical practice require the informed consent to be obtained prior to any removal or addition of a medication except in emergency situations. The goal of this legislation is to ensure that children are not abused in these treatment settings, not to limit access to appropriate, regulated, and licensed residential care for children who are in need of these services. Licensing creates a baseline of expectations to which all programs within a state can be held accountable. Effective licensing requirements help promote client rights, staff competence, quality improvement, and consistent practice. They provide the constants the solid ground from which innovative and transformative practice can be launched. They also provide a degree of safeguard against the potential harm to children, events of a type that can undermine efforts to create meaningful change. All of us working in licensed residential centers should support this goal. All residential treatment programs should provide for all of the child's developmental needs, including mental health care, physical health care, and educational needs, be licensed within the states where they practice, and adhere to national standards, encourage parents to be active parts of the treatment teams for their youth, and employ a well-trained, multidisciplinary, culturally competent staff. Thank you for raising this important issue, and when it's appropriate, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Ms. Brown, and you'll be recognized for 10 minutes, Ms. Brown.
Chairman Miller and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss our work on residential programs for teens. This morning, you've already heard a number of heart-wrenching examples of individual cases of abuse and death in residential facilities. Now, I'd like to try to shed some light on what we know about the national picture. To clarify the difference between our work and the case studies that you heard, my remarks are based on our ongoing work. Over the past year, we conducted national surveys of 3 separate agencies in each state: child welfare, health and mental health, and juvenile justice. Each of these state agencies may place youth experiencing behavioral and emotional challenges in residential facilities. In our survey, we asked about a broad range of facilities, including the types that you've heard about today. We also visited 4 states. Today, I will discuss what we know about the extent of youth maltreatment in these facilities across the nation, what states are doing to protect youth in these facilities, and what federal agencies are doing to oversee state efforts. In summary, youth maltreatment and fatalities occurred in both government and private facilities all across the nation. However, we don't know the full extent of the problem because many states either don't collect or don't report data for all residential facilities. Regarding oversight, we identified gaps in state activities that leave youth in some facilities at greater risk of maltreatment or death. We identified similar gaps in federal activities. Regarding the extent of the problem, in 1 year, 34 states reported to HHS more than 1,500 incidents of youth maltreatment that were committed by facility staff. As you can see, hopefully, from the graphic above, the proportion of incidents related to physical abuse was 24%, to neglect or deprivation of necessities to 44%, and sexual abuse 9%. Officials in the states we visited cited factors such as a lack of experienced staff, insufficient training, or lack of appropriate supervision as causes. In addition, in our survey, 28 states reported at least 1 death in residential facilities. This next graphic shows that 16 states reported deaths due to accidents, 9 due to suicide, and fewer states to homicide and the use of seclusion and restraint. I should mention here, though, that deaths related to seclusion and restraint may also be categorized as accidents in some cases. It's important to note that these data are not complete. The number of adverse incidents is very likely more numerous and more widespread than reported for a number of reasons. For example, in many states, officials said they lack authority under state law or regulation to collect data on private facilities that do not receive government funds. And the HHS database I mentioned earlier tracks fatalities that result from maltreatment, but not from suicides or accidents, both of which may be an indicator of neglect or other problems. Regarding my second topic, state oversight. As you know, under the current structure, states are primarily responsible for ensuring the well-being of youth in residential facilities. To do this, they have a range of tools at their disposal, including licensing, standards, monitoring, and enforcement when violations are found. All states in our survey reported having some licensing processes. However, the types of facilities licensed and the licensing requirements varied from state to state, and we found gaps in the licensing activity. Most notably, state agencies often exempted certain types of facilities from licensing, and in particular, private residential schools and academies. This is worrisome because owners can self-identify the type of facility they operate. Therefore, a facility could bypass state requirements by identifying itself as a type of facility not subject to licensing. In addition, for those facilities that states did license, they used standards that addressed many but not all of the primary risks to youth well-being that you've heard about today. Almost all states reported that licensed facilities are required to meet basic standards such as the safety of the physical plant. However, about a third of state child welfare and health and mental health agencies reported that they do not require written suicide prevention plans. Once a facility is licensed, regular monitoring helps ensure that licensing standards are taken seriously and that risks to youth well-being are addressed quickly. However, officials in 3 of the 4 states we visited were unable to meet their goals for conducting regular site visits for monitoring at residential facilities. They were also unable to conduct unannounced site visits, which can reveal conditions that might not be seen during a regular announced visit. These officials cited fluctuating levels of resources and large workloads as factors limiting their visits. There are also other approaches to overseeing facilities. For example, some states required accreditation, either in addition to or instead of licensing as a condition of serving youth under state care. Finally, turning to federal oversight of state efforts, the Departments of Health and Human Services, Justice, and Education all have certain processes in place through their grant programs to hold states accountable for the well-being of youth in general. However, as with the states, we found gaps in their oversight related to residential facilities. For example, under current law, federal agencies do not have the authority to hold states accountable for youth well-being in private residential facilities unless those facilities serve youth in programs that receive federal funds. For those facilities that are under federal purview, federal requirements did not always address the primary risks to youth well-being. HHS, Justice, and Education all reported that they do not have authority to require that states have suicide prevention plans as a condition for receiving grants that they administer. Similarly, with one exception, federal programs also do not require that states ensure the proper use of seclusion and restraint practices in residential facilities. Federal agencies did not always include residential facilities in their oversight visits and have not used all of the enforcement tools available to them, such as financial penalties. In conclusion, the results of our ongoing study show that the current federal-state oversight structure is inadequate to protect youth from maltreatment and death at a time when they are most vulnerable. Given the wide variety of facility types and the variations among state laws, there are no simple solutions. Without meaningful data, state and federal agencies don't know the extent of maltreatment in their jurisdictions, so they cannot accurately assess the risk to youth in facilities or best target their oversight resources. And licensing alone holds no guarantees without clear standards, regular monitoring, and a full array of enforcement tools. The comprehensive results of our work will be included in a report to be released next month. This report will provide options for action that states, federal agencies, and Congress may want to consider in any restructuring effort. We also anticipate that our report will contain recommendations for action that federal agencies can implement now under the existing structure. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I would be happy to answer any questions you or others on the committee would have.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony, as disturbing as it is. It's important that this committee hear it, and hopefully this Congress hear it. I've been involved with the attempt to protect children in out-of-home placements for over 30 years. And I guess I'm saddened by the fact that 30 years later we still see this number of children put in these positions of jeopardy while the government looks on because of the patchwork and incomplete system that we have here, so that we can have simple but vital information about these programs, as Ms. Brown has pointed out. You know, the last time this country witnessed somebody with a bag over their head and a noose around their neck, the world was horrified, the nation was embarrassed, and it was at Abu Ghraib. To be told by this committee that this is considered a valid therapy, I guess, or a practice by somebody in the care of somebody else's child, and that putting a noose over their head, around their neck, with a bag over their head, that this was acceptable, I think would horrify this nation again. But unfortunately, we don't have a picture of that. We just have the sad result of what happened to that young person. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that people would do this to somebody else's child. Ms. Coots, in your testimony, you describe 8 programs where children were abused and a number of cases involving misleading marketing practices by programs and referral services. To the extent that you can you identify these programs and services that either abused these kids or used misleading marketing practices?
You'd like me to name for the record the ones, there's 8
yes.
cases of death and abuse, and then there's the
Yes.
table we had of the
Yes.
misleading marketing. All right, let me go through those with you. The names of the facilities, the first 4 were death cases, and that was the Arizona Boys Ranch, Lone Star Expeditions, Star Ranch, and Summit Quest Academy. That was cases 1 through 4. The other 4 cases, which were abuse cases, the first 3 of the first 4 also were abuse cases. Case numbers 5 through 8 were Kids of North Jersey, Bethel Boys Academy, Whitmore Academy, and Royal Gorge Academy. So that's the 8 cases of death and abuse. With the marketing, some of the 10 in there are multiple hits, if you will. So I'll go through those. Case number 1 was the C.S. Landry Foundation, and that was one of the cases you saw in my opening statement on the monitor of the tax scheme where people were asking others to make donations for their children. The second case was Spring Creek Lodge Academy. Cases 3, 4, and 5 were Lone Star Expeditions, which was the same as our case number 2, the death case. Cases 6, 7, and 10 were Teen Paths, and that is a referral service. And cases 8 and 9 were Parent Help, and that is also a referral service.
You know, if your child applies to college, they ask a lot of questions about your child. When you finally get to the final steps, they want a lot of information. To what extent did you played a series of tapes about representations about these programs, and you're not a mental health professional, and I understand that, but to what extent was there any attempt to delineate the information about the child in terms of what maybe pre-diagnosis had been, other placements of that child, what other determinations were made by mental health workers or psychiatric health workers that child might have been exposed to? In many instances, these are not the first placements of these children. Was any effort to develop that history and then inform those parents what would or would not be available that was aligned with that?
Yeah, I made some of the calls myself, actually, and for the cases that I called 5 of them, and 4 of them didn't ask any questions at all about my fictitious child. The 5th one did ask a lot of interesting and good questions. We made in total 30 or so calls, and in most cases the focus was on the marketing, not actually extracting information on the child and whether the child would be a good fit for that program. So that, I think that's kind of, do you want to add to that, Andy?
Yes, most of the conversation centered on
Could you just identify yourself for the visual record?
Andy O'Connell from GAO.
Thank you.
Of the 30 phone calls that we made, the big pitch was about the program itself and not about your child, and mostly centered on the cost and how you could finance the cost to pay to go to these schools.
Ms. Whitehead and Ms. Martin Crawford, after you arrived at your programs, was there any attempt to take your personal history, to discuss that with you, and then to tell you what the plan of treatment would be? I'm not going to with the validity of the treatment, but just if those acts were engaged in.
Well, when I first arrived, actually, there was no real set of treatment plan established, but we were required to write out our life history and our sexual history in detail, and that was how they gathered information, or they'd read our diaries from home. But we were never notified of any kind of treatment plan or goals or anything like that.
Mr. Martin Crawford.
Likewise, anything that we had actually been asked, as I mentioned earlier, was when it came down to our past or any plan of treatment, it was really what we did. And then if we came with a list, say I smoked pot a couple times, that wasn't good enough, and we had to say that we were doing cocaine or crack in order to speak with our family. So any type of writing down what we needed help on was sort of, they told us what we needed help on, whether we did or didn't.
Mr. Coots, in one of the narratives in your report, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in fact drug tests were administered to one of the students repeatedly. The drug tests were negative and they were reported as positive to the parents. Is that correct, including the initial?
That's correct. And also what was just described here, we did see evidence where kids were forced to confess to things far worse than they had actually done. That was significant evidence that not just the kid we looked at, but a number of kids in that program were forced to do that at the admission process.
And those confessions were then used how?
Well, then they had to keep repeating them during the counseling that I guess it's called the MI. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's called the moral inventory. Ours were used not as much for the counseling as for parents. So when we had a group...
Those were then told the parents that progress...
Right.
Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but those were used to tell the parents what?
That way when my parents came and I was saying, oh, yeah, well, by the way, I was, smoking crack and, shooting people or something. That way they thought that they did the right thing in putting me there and that I really needed to be there and this would, save my life.
Those admissions were viewed as progress being made.
Or at least as good enough reason for me to be there, so it made them feel better. Like if I had just told them the truth that I had smoked marijuana a few times, it wouldn't seem as though I really needed to be there as much.
Dr. Belancy, I could give you an hour, but I'm only going to give you about 2 minutes to tell me what, as a professional and your experience. Is my time up? Yeah, you got 2 minutes. What your impression is of this, and I'll come back to you in a second round, but I've got to move on to other members.
I mean, it makes me ill hearing it, frankly. And to think that this is being done in the name of treatment is abhorrent to me. Just to clarify the difference between the programs that you're hearing about in my facility, we don't advertise. Children are referred to us by their public school or by the state of Massachusetts Child Welfare or Child Mental Health agencies. Our admissions office is run by a licensed clinical social worker.
I understand that, but let me explain.
Sure.
The marketing here is to desperate parents who have gone through much of that before. I don't want to compare it to your program at this point. I just want your professional impressions of this.
It's abuse. There's nothing about what you're hearing that can be construed as treatment, therapeutic intervention, care. I had the same association you had to Abu Ghraib when I was hearing this. This is no way to treat anyone, particularly someone who is already struggling with depression, substance abuse, mental health issues. It's only going to exacerbate the problem and not lead to treatment. So there's no way that I could begin to defend any of the practices that you're hearing as anything remotely appropriate or acceptable.
Thank you. Ms. McCarthy, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Miller. This is actually the second hearing that we have put together on this, and I thank the chairman for following through and his long work on this issue. Mr. Platts and I, when we had this hearing going back last fall, and we had the parents speaking and telling their stories, it was heartbreaking. With that being said, the legislation that was introduced yesterday excuse me, to try to make a difference. With anything down here, we started hearing pushback immediately. And I find it hard, mainly because when we're trying to do something so that there are standards that children are not abused, I don't understand why there's a pushback. When we're looking at how possibly these schools or treatment areas can have some standards to take care of the children, I don't understand why there's a pushback on that. I don't understand if you're dealing with children that already have some problems, why we shouldn't be doing background checks on those that, quote, are supposed to be helping them. So I have a real hard time understanding a lot of that. But with that being said, I need to ask some questions. And Ms. Brown, your testimony said there was not a single website, federal agency, or other entity that collects nationwide data on incidents of these programs. Our bill calls for a central website which will have data on these facilities and their operating systems, and requires marketing materials to include a link to this website so parents can see information for themselves. Would you think that this would actually help parents make a decision on exactly what they're putting their child into?
I think that that website has a number of advantages that it offers. The first and most important one would be to give parents information that would help them make an informed decision. This is assuming that incidents of abuse and facility names and that kind of thing were all contained on the website. There are also a couple of other advantages. In the hearing in the fall, we talked about facilities that, if they were shut down in one state, moved to another state, right. And a website like this could help try to prevent that kind of activity. And then the third piece is, in our surveys and in our state visits, we learned that state agencies, the officials in state agencies that place children in residential facilities, don't always share information with each other in the way that they should. And so sometimes one agency may have decided that they didn't really want to place their children in a facility because of problems they knew, and they didn't tell the other agencies. So if this website could be constructed in a way that it had all of the information that you have in the bill, I think it would be helpful to the agencies as well.
The other thing I wanted to follow up on, with a lot of the issues that we deal here on the Education Committee and the research that we do on certain bills, I have found that when we pass a law here, and we put it out to the states, we really are not getting the information that we need to make the correct decisions. So I've really become some person of I like data. I like a lot of data now. And with that being said, there's only one database that collects some of this information, the one operated by HHS called the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. The federal government provides funds to states for reporting abuse and neglect to this organization, but a lot of the states aren't putting that data in there. We found that with some of the educational standards. How would you feel about having why doesn't HHS get more comprehensive data from states on the number of incidents of youth abuse and death, and how can we improve on that?
Well, you're absolutely right that the quality of the data in that system is only as good as what the states provide. And as I said, there are a number of different areas, particularly related to private facilities, that states don't necessarily collect information on. There are also problems with the way that some of these systems are constructed, so that even though they may be reporting the data, it's impossible to isolate those incidents that happened at residential facilities versus other areas or within a child's family. One of the things that we have recommended in our report that will be coming out soon is that HHS does step up and try to work with the states and figure out what some of the problems are and how they can improve that data reporting for that system, because it's used in HHS widely. And I think that there's might be a loophole in the law right now where states are expected to report these data that says to the maximum extent practicable.
Right.
And that does, I think, give a little bit of leeway that I think it's been long enough that these states have reported this data that it might be fair to expect them to report it more completely now.
I agree. I want to thank the whole panel for the testimony and for the parents that are here that were testified in the past. And again, hopefully we can get a handle on this and get this bill onto the floor and passed, and hopefully prevent abuse to many of the children that are out there and help the parents. Thank you. With that,
Mr. Chairman, could I just add one real quick thing to that? It'll take just a second. What we found at the case study level, too, is that a lot of the abuse and torture and things like that never gets reported to the states. So that's just another point, that even if the states aren't reporting it, they're not getting it from the programs. A lot of the programs we looked at were cited for not reporting abuse, and most abuse maybe never gets reported in the first place.
Mr. McKeon will now be recognized for 50 minutes, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I want to begin by thanking all the witnesses for their testimony here today. I strongly believe that the instances of neglect, abuse, and death at these facilities that we've been talking about over the last few months are totally unacceptable and must be stopped. That goes without, probably should go without even need to being said. I still don't feel, though, that the committee has a full grasp on the extent of the problem or possible solutions. As you just said, a lot of these things are not even reported. So I'm glad this hearing has been convened today to learn more about these facilities and give members an opportunity to ask questions about them. Mr. Cooch, you talked about 8 instances of death. Has there been any prosecution on those deaths that you're aware of?
Yes, there was one case of a criminal conviction for third-degree assault and false imprisonment, and that person served 1 month. There was also a plea, but there was no time served. On all the other ones, there were no criminal prosecutions or charges.
So murder is okay now? I mean, how, listening to just what you said about it, I can't even understand how we don't have 8 people in jail for murder in those instances. How do you possibly not have?
I agree with you. It's very difficult to look at this and wonder why there's not more criminal aggressive effort in this particular case. There was a lot of civil activity, lots of civil settlements, but that doesn't fix the problem with the people who were doing the abuse. And the real issue, I think we talked about your last hearing, these people are moving around, so who knows what program they've moved to next. And
but you have a
there's
death.
no trail then.
I mean, you know of a death.
Yes.
The police don't find out about it, or they just shrug it off and write traffic tickets, or what? You know, I mean, I just don't even understand this.
It may be that it's difficult to prove in a court of law. I mean, I can't really explain
to
it
prove
fully.
How the death occurred, or that there was a death. I mean,
there was clearly a death, and there was clearly abuse in some of the cases we looked at, and why there was no more criminal on that, I just can't explain it for you fully.
I just don't understand that. Ms. Whitehead, Mr. Martin Crawford, both of you seem to be doing quite well now. Apparently not as a result of your stay in these institutions, but how did you get your lives turned around?
Well, I think primarily just doing the work that I've been doing in terms of advocacy. I mean, it really took a good 10 years for me to kind of get through all of the depression stuff and the anxiety. And
it just happened, or did you have
well, no, I had some therapy
treatment
around it, but really it was about not really understanding my experience, not really framing it as abuse or, you know, and speaking with Dr. Pinto at length and understanding that there's some legitimacy to my claim and finding a place to put that. So I think that, you know, it was that confusion and that internal battle that took so long, you know, the nightmares and understanding where that came from, and then understanding that it wasn't therapy.
Excuse me. What I'm trying to get at is you apparently had some problems,
Sure.
which is why you were sent to this place.
Sure.
And if you could just block that out, how did you get the problems that got you to that point in the first place? How did those get taken care of?
Therapy.
After you
After
came
yes.
you came back home. And was your experience the same?
My experience, for the most part, when it came down to the issues that got me into the family, marijuana use, things like that, most of it really just came out of maturity. At some point, I just realized that doing the right thing, going to school, getting a degree, and becoming a teacher meant more to me than hanging out and getting high. And as much as I hate to say it, this testimony here, because of the thorough background checks that certified teachers get, could be problematic for that. But it's worth the risk. I mean, I guess my certification means more to me than these people's.
Thank you very much. Dr. Balanci, is it?
Yes.
In your testimony, you seem to have pretty extensive knowledge of the legislation that was introduced last night.
Yes.
When did you see the legislation?
Tuesday of this week.
Tuesday of this week?
Yes.
Today is Thursday?
Yes.
Okay. I have some questions I would like to direct at all the witnesses. Can you tell me how many private residential treatment programs or boot camps there are nationwide? I guess that's no.
I think it's safe to say the answer from our perspective is no, we don't know.
And so if we don't know how many there are, we probably would not have numbers to break them down by state. How many different types of treatment programs?
Let the record show the answer appears to be no again. Silence would be helpful.
The answer is no.
Yeah, thank you.
How many different types of treatment programs are there in the country?
I believe that would depend on what they call themselves. That goes from anywhere from emotional growth, residential treatment, wilderness. I mean, there's so many different names that it's almost impossible to tell, because if we listed 20 names right now, there would be 21 tomorrow.
If I may, I mean, I think part of the problem in even beginning to get the scope of the issue is that there is no agreement on the terms to define these programs. And I think one of the things that we really need from the national level is a definition of the range of out-of-home care options that exist, and then clear standards to correspond to each of those definitions of care.
Okay. One of the solutions that's been suggested is some sort of federal oversight, and I'm curious about the capacity that would be required to regulate these programs on a federal level. Can any of you talk about the manpower, expertise, and funding that is going to be needed to establish and then to monitor these programs by a federal agency? If this doesn't...
Yeah, I was trying to think if there was anything I could contribute to that. And I guess the only thing I can say is in our options that we lay out for Congress to consider, one of them is direct regulation, which is the first part of that, the bill that relates to asking HHS to monitor the facilities. And we don't know the cost of that or the capacity. When we looked at that option and other options, we considered the fact that there are really three factors that need to be weighed against each other or traded off. And one is cost, and the second is the federal reach, how far you want the federal government to be involved in this, and the third is the extent of protection that children would receive, or how wide the net would be.
Where would the federal government get the jurisdiction to become
for direct
involved
regulation?
in this?
Well, according to our counsel, that would come from the issue of interstate commerce, and there are two ways that that could be applied. The first one is through the marketing practices that we talked about today, and those occurring throughout the government. And the second one is related to the number of youth that are actually placed across state lines.
Okay, so if you had a state that had an organization within the state that did not cross boundaries, that only had students coming from within their state, where would the federal government have the ability to get involved in this program?
Well, and that the question there of if they don't accept or place children in other states would be, what are their marketing practices? and do those have a wider reach? I know that many of these facilities...
But the ones that are just done within a state, where would the federal government have the ability to intervene?
The way that the federal government in those cases has influenced that and would be able to in the future would be through the use of federal funds.
But if they're not receiving any federal funds, as I understand these programs aren't, where would the federal government have the ability to intervene according to the Constitution?
I have to tell you, first of all, I'm not a legal or a constitutional expert.
Do we have any on the panel? Okay. That'd probably be better to address somewhere else then.
Right.
Pardon? Okay. At this time, I yield to Mr. Platts for my remaining 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. McKeon, and I want to thank the chairman and the staff of the committee for their important leadership and work on this issue, and certainly thank all of our witnesses here today, especially Ms. Whitehead and Mr. Martin Crawford, for your efforts to try to take the trauma that each of you suffered through not to be repeated against others. And your willingness to be here, not just in testifying, but your advocacy for the rights of other children that are still in these programs. I tell you, as a parent sitting here today, as well as in our last hearing, it's truly sickening to hear of the care given to children entrusted to adults to help better the lives of those children, and instead of resulted, as we've heard in some instances, in the deaths of those children. And as a nation, we certainly have a moral responsibility to do our best to not allow this to happen. Mr. Coots, I'd like to start with your comments. First, in the 4 cases where there were deaths, are any of those facilities still operating today, or, as to the best of your knowledge, any of the individuals associated with those facilities still operating under perhaps different names?
The answer is yes. Cases 2 and 4 are still open under the same name and same individuals involved. Numbers 1 and 3 are closed.
And under cases 2 and 4, are those institutions or facilities ones that there were legal actions of any kind brought against them?
There was an investigation of case 4 by the state, and for the other one there was a civil settlement, and so, but no criminal.
As Mr. McKeon stated, it's hard to understand that scenario, and that there's not more scrutiny and action given the circumstances that you've shared with us. You referenced in your testimony that in 3 of the 8 cases you looked at, the victim was placed in the program by the state or in consultation with state authorities. To the best of your knowledge, was there any follow-up site visits, interviews, investigations by the state authorities or entities that placed those individuals to make sure that the child being placed was receiving the care that they were intended to?
Not until it was too late. I think that's the problem. And then there was lots of investigative activity, and that gets into the whole issue here. Hopefully that the committee's focus here is on preventing these things from happening, and that's really what I would say you should focus on, because once you get to the investigative phase, it's too late, and as we're hearing here, oftentimes there's no consequences. But we're talking also about Medicaid money. Several of them had Medicaid money, and then one of them had money from the juvenile justice system also. So there was various types of money, either paying for part or all the tuition, even though it was a private program.
Yeah, my focus is not the investigation after allegations of abuse, but if a state is saying we are placing this child in your custody at state direction, as to your knowledge, there is no, and we will be back in a month to see how that child is doing, how you're operating, how you're caring, to the best of your knowledge, that did not occur again until it was too late.
I can't say that for sure, but if it was ineffective oversight, and it may not have been random, unannounced visits, which is something I know that's been discussed, and that may be an element of your bill, I believe, but that would be something that would be I would suggest, no matter who is responsible, that random unannounced visits would be something that could help this. Again, if it's a wilderness program, that would be difficult because you'd have to parachute into the wilderness to do a real unannounced visit, but otherwise, some of the physical structures, you could do a random unannounced visit.
Yeah, probably a necessity to truly get an understanding. In your testimony, you also talked about, you say a number of states do not license or otherwise regulate certain types of private programs. Do you know how many states do regulate in some fashion private residential facilities?
I'll let Ms. Brown answer that more. So, I mean, with respect to our case studies, some were licensed and some weren't. That was true last fall also.
Okay.
I think one of the issues there is for private facilities, whether they are receiving government funds or whether they are not. And all of the states that we heard from license some types of private facilities. The issue is that there are some that are exempt from licensing. In some cases, it might be, as I mentioned, academies and boarding schools are the ones that are most often not licensed. And then there are also examples like faith-based facilities that would also be exempt from licensing. There are 6 states that do that.
If just a quick follow-up on that, is there a best example of a state that you would point to that does regulate private facilities?
I wish I could give you a simple answer to that question. We have an idea of what we would like to see the oversight and regulatory structure look like, but as we looked at the states, none of the states that answered our surveys, which was all but one, had the complete package. Some had much more developed oversight standards, but they didn't reach very far as the number of programs, the types of programs they covered. Some had much broader coverage, but their standards and oversight were only this deep. So it's hard to pick one out.
No one perfect example to point to? Okay.
No, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. We're going to be dealing with this subject, if we don't deal with it directly, at least indirectly through the reauthorization of juvenile justice and delinquency prevention. So it's an important issue as we deal with juveniles. I'd like to ask Ms. Brown, you know, we know what we're trying to cover. You kind of know it when you see it, but I'm just wondering if you'd looked at the definition that we have in the bill to see if it covers everything that needs to be covered and doesn't leave anything out. It, for example, does not cover government-run programs. Should government-run programs be covered?
In our survey, we looked both at government-operated facilities and then private facilities, those that were exclusively private and those that received government funds. And we found very similar problems with the government-operated facilities. There's the organization in the Department of Justice that investigates civil rights abuses for institutionalized persons in public facilities has an annual report that provides detailed information on different cases that they've investigated that sounds very similar to the case studies that Mr. Coots reported on.
Are there any other programs, if government programs ought to be considered, any other programs that would not be covered by this definition that ought to be covered?
The issue of...
if you're not prepared to answer that now, if you could think about it and get back to us, that'd be helpful.
I'd be happy to.
Mr. Kurtz, I've seen studies that suggest that boot camps just don't work if it's just a disciplinary program. However, if you have boot camp plus a significant education component, then it does work. And then it occurs to me, if you have an education component without the boot camp, it'd probably work anyway. How do we deal with the question of whether boot camps work as we try to regulate them?
The ones we looked at, and again, I can only speak to the case studies we looked at, and I'm not expert at this. The ones we looked at had very little educational program. It was more a discipline, more of a military-style to, I guess, help youth that maybe had trouble with discipline or whatever the case may be. But I didn't see a lot of education in the case studies we've looked at, so I can't really address how effective.
Did they accomplish a goal?
Again, I haven't looked at them all. The ones that we looked at, there was the more severe abuse, I would say, of kids at the boot camps. They had more of a difficult environment for the kids.
Well, if they weren't abusing them, did the underlying program work?
Again, the case studies we looked at, I would say no. But again, I can only speak to a few case studies of that, so that's probably not a fair look at all of the boot camps.
Dr. Valanci, if you're having this physical activity, would it help if you required the students to have physical exams before they signed up?
Absolutely.
Should the staff be certified in CPR?
Yes.
Mrs. Brown, we have in here that you ought to have standards. For example, there ought to be in a medical emergency plan, but it doesn't say what's in the plan. Who should decide what specifics are in the plans? Should that be a state-level certification, or should the bill include specifically what should be in the plan?
I haven't looked at the bill in that amount of detail to be able to comment section by section on that. I know that there's something to be said for having broad standards that are agreed upon at a very high level that everyone can be expected to meet. When you get down to the details of what should exactly be in a medical plan, that may vary depending on the type of student that's being served.
Well, maybe Mr. Kurtz or somebody else could comment too on, we have staff shouldn't be convicted felons, particularly in child abuse areas. Should there be minimal standards for staff in these things, education levels?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but I would say...
Then who ought to set the standards?
I don't know who should set the standards necessarily, but I think you mentioned something else in your comment. There is background checks, too, because we did see certain programs do background checks, other ones don't do background checks. So we had instances where prior felons were involved with these programs. We've seen that before, so that's something that's quite important, I believe.
If you're trying to accomplish a goal, there ought to be some minimum education requirements, some qualifications for staff if you're trying to accomplish a goal. Who ought to set the standards? Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess that's something we need to be looking at. I yield back. Wait a minute. I think we might have an answer.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an answer. It's a recommendation. I think there are a number of accrediting bodies. There's a number of training programs that set their own standards, particularly around behavior management. And to expand on my earlier answer of just yes to needing CPR training, there's so much that must go on before you even get to that point. And even then, I don't think that most of the interventions that you're hearing about are justifiable from a clinical treatment modality. It's not clinical treatment. But even when you're a good program that's licensed and accredited and have highly trained and qualified staff, bad things can still happen. And so having a rubric that you follow that does meet some baseline platform of licensure and regulation, I think is at least the place to start to try to clarify when bad outcomes happen, what you can learn from that so that it doesn't happen again.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would hope that somewhere along the lines we would consider what the goal of these programs might be, what outcomes they're trying to get, and the regulations really ought to be consistent with that. Having plans and this kind of thing, at some point, some of these programs are working, some of these methodologies are working, and some don't.
Well, I think that's part of the problem we've encountered here, because there are some which are considered successful by parents and others, and maybe even by those operators. The suggestion is because some are good, you can't look at the bad. And I think we've got to delineate these programs, because there's clearly practices here that have been designed over a period of years, and after various incidents and run-ins with various agencies, these people have learned to navigate the gray areas between federal, state regulation, definitions, and all the rest of that. And this is not emerged by accident. This is designed. There's been numerous ones of these programs that are the most troublesome are third and fourth iterations of what previous problems and third and fourth career opportunities for people who were engaged in previous and serious offenses. So this is not an accident that this industry is sprung up in the manner in which it has. Ms. Shea Porters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really have more of a comment. First, I would like to say how sorry I am that you've experienced what you have. As a former social worker, I'm absolutely horrified. I can't imagine why there wasn't any oversight, why nobody stepped in. And so I say I admire both of you for being here and sharing your story and making a difference. And I'd like to thank the chairman and those who worked on this to make sure that we have the changes. I also would like to say the federal government does step in. They step in, they can provide money to states to help them license and oversee. So I see it as an appropriate role of the federal government. Indeed, you know, we have some groups that support animals that would have had more clout than some organizations had to help you. So the other comment I wanted to make was simply a question. I know that on the website one of the proposals would be that they would have access, that they could take a look. But do you know another way from your own experience to help families recognize the pitfall of an organization? How would you go about it? Is there something else you could add to this discussion about how to warn families before they put their children in bad treatment facilities?
Well, I think sort of what Dr. Belanci was speaking to in terms of accreditation, I think that, you know, regulation is important, absolutely, but anybody can open up a facility and call themselves a therapeutic location and yet use these aversive methods that are causing more harm than any benefit. So I think, you know, that would be a recommendation, accreditation, as well as a facility with an open campus. I commend the Walker School for opening up their school to parents, because the facility I attended and a lot of facilities I hear about, the campuses are closed, no unannounced visits. People have to call. Parents aren't allowed to come in. And so nobody really knows what's happening. And I think, so those are primarily the recommendations, and close to home. I mean, families shouldn't have to be torn apart to heal.
I would say even with the distance from home, even if kids were sent away, one of the main things that any parent should look for is, does your child have absolute access to child protective services and to calling home to their family? Keeping those two things away, you're just looking for trouble. The other thing for parents that are just browsing websites and not really doing research, if that's the case, a lot of this is, you'll see success stories that are, you know, oh, I just graduated, and it's really people that graduated this year or last year, you know, at the most 2 years, saying, you know, how the place saved their lives and all that. You look a little further down the road, and these kids, I mean, it took me probably about 4 or 5 years to start seeing it, and, you know, it progresses as time goes by to now. I even have my friends' parents that are telling me how much they hated the experience that their child went through, because it takes a long time to really get over the brainwashing and the scars that you really go through. So, I mean, to look at the websites and all the success stories that they tout out, from the parents to the students, graduation speeches, whatever the case may be, you know, try to be realistic. If you're only getting stuff that's, you know, within the last year, chances are it's because other people have stopped talking to them for some reason or another.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Brown, a follow-up to when I asked about the best practices, and you talked about a lot of the states have good aspects, but no one state kind of had the whole package. And I don't expect you to have it here today, but could you follow up with us what you've identified you believe to be the whole package, you know, of, you know, this state's good attributes, you know, standards, this state's, but what would, from your investigations and research, be that whole package? If you could follow up to the committee in writing with that, that would be helpful.
Certainly.
Thank you. In your testimony, you referenced the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act and the authority of the Attorney General to bring actions, and this relates to state and local facilities, public facilities. Are you aware of, in say, the last 5 years, how many investigations and or actions have actually been initiated by the Attorney General of the United States under this act?
The first thing to say is that the officials from this organization told us that they get more referrals each year than they can handle. But they do issue an annual report, and I'm stalling right now because I'm hoping that
the Attorney General's office gets more referrals than they can handle?
Yes, this special litigation division that deals with the civil rights of institutionalized persons. And so in 2006, they investigated over 175 facilities in 34 states. And their report does contain quite a bit of detail about the problems that they saw.
Mr. Chairman, if we could have the report included as part of the record and we receive copies of that, that would be wonderful. So it sounds like...
Without objection.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it sounds that they are trying to be dutiful in their fulfilling their responsibilities, but perhaps don't have the resources to be... Did they give any indication of if they did 170 some investigations, was it twice that they received, but so 50% they didn't get to, or that wasn't shared?
Well, they get many, many more referrals that they can investigate. How many of those would be valid ones that they should actually be pursuing, I don't know.
Okay.
I can tell you that in our upcoming report, we are making a recommendation that relates to trying to encourage the other federal agencies to work closely with them so that if they find information about problematic facilities, they get that referral over to the Department of Justice so they can follow up.
Excellent, because the more coordination, communication, the more likely we can get the bad apples identified and pursued. Mr. Coots, a follow-up. In your testimony, you talked about the referral services. I mean, clearly, it seems like false advertising. In Pennsylvania, we have Unfair Trade Practices Act that would seem to govern some of this. Are you aware of any actions at the state level or federal, but more likely at the state level, to pursue any of these entities that have engaged in the type of advertising or fraudulent or apparently misleading information?
Andy O'Connell from GAO. Just to follow up on that question, we are in dialogue with the FTC regarding our work, and I don't know what they're doing right now. You'd have to ask them, but we are.
You've shared your results with the FTC for them?
Yes, we have.
Okay.
And on the one tax scheme that you saw in our
yep. On the 501,
we are making a referral to IRS on that.
Great, thank you. Mr. Coots, I know you investigated the 8 specific cases. What's the youngest age of any child that you're aware of that has been placed, or if anyone else would want to answer that as well? And I've heard 12 a number of times, 12-year-olds. Are there children younger than 12 in these facilities?
Of our cases, 12 is about the youngest, but there's evidence that are kids under 10 years old in these programs. Yes.
My program actually works with children between the ages of 5 to 13 in our residential setting.
How about in any of the wilderness or that type, the boot camp type facility? Anyone as
At
well?
ours as well, the youngest was 12 years old. I think 6th, 7th grade was pretty much where their cutoff was at that point. But I mean, there were kids that stayed there, although they were family members of staff members that ended up then being students later on. So they were there all the time. But the only ones whose parents actually admitted them, the youngest was about 12 years old, a kid that pretty much just had ADD. And while he was there, developed the behaviors that most of the people pretended to have, and was actually shot last year as a result.
Representative Platts at the other end. I'll go ahead. I had something to add, too.
I know of a facility in Utah called Majestic Ranch that admitted youth as young as 7.
At the other end of the spectrum, we had one program where kids were held beyond their will after 18, which is the other end.
Yeah, that was one of your cases you referenced.
Yes, there were several kids. One was held there over 13 years.
My time's expired. I don't know if we'll have another round or not, but again, thank you.
Mr. Coots, again, in the number of the case studies, like you, and then maybe Ms. Whitehead and Mr. Martin Crawford would want to respond also, but in a number of instances, we have students participating in physical actions, maybe abusive actions against other students. Can you outline that or tell me what you know about that, and then I'd ask the other two to respond from their experiences?
Yeah, we saw students being involved with abuse and torture of other students, typically at the direction of some of the staff or owners. But yes, kids typically be against their will being responsible for that and being told to carry somebody around, kick them, beat them, whatever the case may be. And we saw that last time, too, the 10 cases from last fall, the same type of things where kids were involved. In one of the programs, the actual staff were people who had been program participants. So they went through the program, and their qualifications to be the staff were that they'd been in the program.
Ms. Whitehead?
My facility didn't use any kind of physical intervention with, among students, but what we did, we were required is to sort of, it was called called out in group by other students, and sort of to deflect attention away from, one student, we would have to call another student out on behavior, vague notions of dishonesty, and then they would get subsequently punished, have to do work crew for the day, or rock picking, things like that.
Mr. Martin Crawford?
The same was the case in my program. The students did actually have to physically restrain students. We had to chase them, bring them back. This was the first few times that a student would do it. If you had just become a senior member, you were told by staff, okay, you're a senior member, you should go and chase them now. And then after a while, it sort of becomes second nature. It's almost just, a reflex at that point, because you know that you're expected to do it. So
when you discuss wrapping students up in restraints, that was done by other students?
That was usually initiated by the faculty, but the students assisted. Like, the faculty would say, wrap them up, and then the students were the ones that were forced to do it. The faculty was then the one that would say, put them in the isolation room, and a student would observe. So occasionally, we would let the kids out of the blankets if we thought we wouldn't get in trouble for it, if nobody was looking, but it was something that, if anybody was around, we had no chance of doing.
Dr. Belancy, what's your impression of this?
Once again, I'm horrified. There is no justification for having youth-on-youth interventions like that.
Is there in I don't know what I would call a normal practice? I mean, is there a discussion of this within the profession of whether this is advised or ill-advised, or?
Yes, I think it's very clear in the profession that this is ill-advised and unaccepted practice. One of my comments as I was listening to what could be helpful, and what a parent might want to ask, I'd want to know whether or not, what were the professional qualifications of the staff. I would want to know if there is on-site medical involvement and oversight in an administrative capacity. I'd want to know what the training guidelines were for the staff. I'd want to know what the history of abuse claims were against the agency. In my state, you can find out more about a restaurant by doing a web search for their health standards. Then you can learn about these kinds of programs that are caring for America's youth, and that's an outrage.
Mr. Belancy, I guess like many members, know of families and am involved with young people and older people and their families. My wife does a lot of mental health work with bipolar. I know the struggles and the difficulties, both for the individual suffering from bipolar problems and their families. Ever any suggestion that oatmeal, and I'm not being flip here, it's very serious, any suggestion that oatmeal and exercise itself would cause bipolar to go away?
I have never heard that. It's a serious disorder. It needs to be taken seriously. There are treatment interventions that are successful, that are well studied in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. I've never seen an oatmeal study to show any kind of an outcome. There are some research studies looking at dietary interventions for ADHD, but again, I don't believe that they've shown any significant positive outcome in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. That's not to say on a case-by-case basis I haven't anecdotally heard stories of reducing sugar content or caffeine benefiting children, particularly adolescents, but nothing regarding your statement.
Well, as I understand it, Mr. Coots, this was held out as in fact, a cure that would be offered, since this interviewer was told that this would make it go away.
That was one of the marketing pitches you heard in the opening statement, yes.
An oatmeal diet?
No, whole grain diet, but I guess it could be oatmeal.
Excuse me, whole grain.
Whole grain diet,
correct,
yes.
Correct the record. Whole grain diet.
I'm confident.
Again, what bothers me is that, again, a fair amount of experience with a lot of these parents and families. You get to your wit's end with a very difficult child, and a difficult child that you've tried different alternatives to help, and with school districts and all of what it entails for some of the clientele of these facilities, and to then suggest things that just aren't based in fact, science, or otherwise, that this will all sort of come true, I really believe is preying, and in a very unethical fashion, preying on the anxieties and the stress that exists in these families. The repercussions of the families engaged in our first hearings, and I assume many of the families that had their children either abused or died in this hearing, repercussions within those families are long-lasting and sometimes very devastating for the adults who later find out maybe that they had participated in this and how badly they feel about it in some cases. In the earlier hearings we discussed in cases where they voluntarily had their children kidnapped from their homes and then realized that what had taken place, certainly when later the child was tragically killed in those programs. So the idea that this is a harmless intervention at many levels, I think, is very dangerous for us as policymakers to consider. Again, we don't want to paint with a very broad brush here, but the fact of the matter is, we're starting to see emerge here some programs that are very dangerous, that are very reckless with respect to the health and welfare of the children that they have in their custody, and they've got that custody, I think, under very suspect representations and conditions to those families and to their parents. Mr. Coots, if I might, if I have a little bit of time left, these financial connections. We went through a long scandal here on colleges referring people to certain student loan lenders, and you might not have got the best interest rate, but here you have a referral service that may be financially connected, I assume through either fees or commissions for the referral of these patients. And so, again, you have no sense that you're getting informed, independent, ethical representations from the phone calls you made. Can you tell us about this, or what you know about the financial arrangements that may create a conflict of interest?
I would say one case was worse than that. You had a husband-wife team claiming to be independent. One was the referral service, one was the actual program. We called the referral service 3 separate times as 3 separate parents with 3 very different kids, and each time we were referred to the same program, and it's because it was a husband-wife connection that was not disclosed.
But they hold themselves out as being independent referrals?
They didn't disclose that to us as the parents, so I don't know if they hold themselves out as that, but there was no evidence anywhere on their web or anything. They told us that, yeah, we're related to this program, and no matter what your problem is, we're going to put you to the same program, which appeared to be the reality of the situation. So there were other issues where I think the referral services are certainly getting money in many cases from the programs for the referrals, and those are undisclosed types of situations typically.
Excuse me, unless you know that as a factor?
Yes, we have cases of that. Yes, absolutely. So the one was the worst case where you had the husband-wife, but you had other situations where you had undisclosed to the parents, the referral service was getting money for each referral they made to the program, or a vacation, or there were other things like that they were getting paid. So there was a financial relationship between them.
A lot of these programs appear to have a 28-day or 30-day. There was a time, and I don't know if it's relevant in this case, where that was related to insurance payments. That you got an insurance benefit that sort of had a 30-day cutoff on it for mental health or treatment. Is that operative in this situation with respect to placement of these young people?
I don't know, but with respect to health insurance, we were marketed by some of the programs, one in particular saying that you might be able to get money back from your health insurance, but what they told us was don't tell them in advance, because I think the word was you'll be up a creek. So they said wait till the end. Well, you know, most insurance programs require pre-approval for substantial disbursements, and so you advise a parent not to talk to the health insurance company, get them to believe they're going to get money at the end of the day. I believe they would be up a creek probably, because most health insurance companies, even for hospital stays, you have to get pre-approval for health insurance. So for something like this that's even possibly not covered at all by health insurance, to give parents that advice is very misleading.
Dr. Pistone,
Yes.
you know of that?
Absolutely. I think the point is that most health insurances would do the due diligence and not fund programs that were unlicensed or unaccredited. So I don't think most health insurances would actually support these programs. Health insurances also want to know that they're getting a return on their investment for treatment. And they would know that these are not programs practicing evidence-based practice or care, and therefore they would not allow payment to these programs. And I think your point is essential about the desperation that these families are finding themselves in as they're searching for appropriate treatment and intervention. I think it's a very large issue. It has to do with access to appropriately licensed, regulated, accredited programs. It has to do with the shortage of child psychiatrists in this country. It has to do with the limitations on health care, particularly behavioral health, and it has to do with mental health stigma.
Thank you. Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering, as I was listening to the testimony, where a lot of these particular facilities are. I was just wondering, Ms. Brown, when you were looking at all of this, if there was a coalition between where these facilities are and maybe that particular state being extremely weak in child protective cases, those states that might be weak or didn't have the finances to be able to do what they need to do, just even through, say, foster care or anything that had to do with children.
We did see some correlation between certain lack of oversight in some states and types of facilities, Utah being one that had a very large number of, a disproportionately large number of boot camps. Now, they've since started to make some changes in their laws and oversight. And we don't know how that's affected the number of facilities there. I think Mr. Kusa's team actually has a map that outlines where some of the different facilities and types are.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add, Andy O'Connell from GAO. We've found that most of these boot camps, wilderness programs, residential treatment centers exist in about 48 states today.
Yeah. That's not just the map, I think, is page 23, 22 or 23 on the GAO testimony, where they demonstrate where their case studies, where the student came, what state they came from to what state they went to the program.
Okay. The more I keep hearing this testimony, some of us are old enough going back to the 60s and the 70s when unfortunately, children that had some mental illnesses were in these particular facilities that, quote, was supposed to be hospitals or treatments for them until investigations like yours has done to expose that these children were living under conditions that were totally unacceptable to the majority of people of the world. And I think that, by having a hearing like this and trying to expose the issues that we're facing with, unfortunately, young people and parents who want to do the right thing for their children are led down this path, as Mr. Miller has said. These parents want the best for their kids, and sometimes they do come to the end of the line. But I think that I do believe the federal government has the right, and certainly we should be able to work it out, whether it's, putting standards to protect children. Your facility, we're not concerned about facilities that are treating our young people as an early age. But in this day and age, I mean, it breaks my heart to hear about, these particular facilities. You think we would have grown or certainly got past on what we should be doing for our children and our young people. So hopefully we'll go forward. Hopefully, a hearing like this, will educate those parents that might be having a problem with their young person now to really go out. And that's why I just think collecting the data and having a place to go for parents to really check out what it is, maybe even working with every DA in this country to set up something with them so that we can put that data in there also and really start collecting the information for more information for those parents. Today is the world of the internet. Today is a website. Put out the ones that are there, that are the good ones or even the bad ones. So parents can make an intelligence. But I do believe the federal government has a role because obviously the states haven't done their job. And I think that's what we're seeing here. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee?
Mr. Chairman, under general leave, I will submit questions in writing.
Thank you. Mr. Platts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before questions, if I could move that we keep the record open for 14 days for additional testimony and for some of the documentation that we've requested.
Yeah, that's fine, without objections.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Balanci, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. One of the follow-up on your testimony, you talk about the membership of the American Association of Children's Residential Centers, and that any member of the association has to be licensed, and you encourage additional accreditation as well. Am I correct in understanding that first the license is by the individual state wherever the facility is located?
Correct.
Are you aware, to be licensed, does it involve any, or does it mandate on-site visits of the facilities to have those licenses? And then also, does it involve or require any follow-up interviews with individuals who have gone through the facilities after they've left them?
I think that's an excellent question. I can't speak to every state because what you're hearing is there's really a patchwork of state licensing and regulation. I can speak to Massachusetts, where they do come on site. They are authorized to come unannounced. There's actually multiple levels of oversight and regulation that my facility comes under. So Department of Education can come from the state. Child Welfare can come from the state because they have children placed in our program. Department of Mental Health can come from the state. Our licensor, which is EEC, can come. And whenever there's an allegation of abuse or neglect against our facility, they do on-site visits. They would meet with the staff. They would talk about the incident. We would provide them the data. We do our own internal investigation. We have a very low threshold, even though we're serving children as young as 5. If a child makes an allegation against a staff person, we investigate that, and we do at times even report on ourselves. And there's a whole division of child welfare, child protective service that has institutional investigational capacity. So I can't speak to whether or not that's a standard, but
how about in Massachusetts, to your specific state, any follow-up with individuals after they've left your facility or other facilities? In other words, to get that feedback after they're no longer on site.
It's a real problem, the follow-up after youth leave programs. There have been times, and I've been at the agency 13 years now, that I've heard about youth making an allegation against a staff person after they have left, and that would be also investigated within the capacity of gathering the data, finding the staff that are probably no longer even there, to try to track down what occurred.
But there's what I'm really after was more like any random sampling of just randomly picking, not because an allegation was made, but just a random, we pick this patient or this individual to follow up with, with the parents, with the individual.
Not that I'm aware of. We do try to do our own outcome studies, and we have staff that call 6, 12. We're trying for even further months out just to see, are we doing what Congressman Scott asked? Can we have data to show that our intervention is yielding results? And it's a real challenge, but we're trying to do the best we can to gather data to show that it's a treatment worth the state's investment.
Right. Thank you. I guess to any of our witnesses, our focus has really been on the medical side or behavior modification, but an important part of any of these facilities, and as the Committee on Education and Labor, is the education that is provided. And through some of our testimony, Ms. White, I think in your testimony you talked that it really didn't exist, that you taught yourself algebra and that you really didn't have an education aspect, even though you were there for a long period of time. What, the best of your knowledge, each of you, education standards are adhered to or enforced, given that we have national standards, what we expect of our states to do for children, whether it be in a public or private setting, we want a minimum level. What kind of oversight occurs, to the best of your knowledge, regarding education standards?
As far as education, that's the only thing that I can give the family school credit for. We did actually have a decent education. Some of us have gone. A few people went to American University. I went to Vassar College. We had a bunch of decent graduates coming out of it. Whether or not these teachers were certified or not to teach the classes is a different question. We did have some that were qualified enough that they could have been certified, but I don't believe they were. At the same time, we also had no time to do anything but do homework. So in that nature, our grades were obviously going to be improved. But at the same time, it is the only thing that the school actually has credentials for. They do give out a New York State Regents diploma. That's actually an official New York State Regents diploma, unlike a couple of other.
So you took the Regents exam?
I took the Regents exams. I took AP college, or not AP, but college credits while I was a senior. I was able to get into a relatively decent school. That's not the case with all programs, and definitely not the case with some of them. It's completely the opposite. But when it comes down to misleading aspects of it, that's the only thing that I could say that they probably told my parents the truth about.
Yeah, and Ms. Whitehead, yours was probably one of those opposite, or from your testimony, not a very good standard?
Right. I mean, my facility was accredited. I don't know what kind of documentation they needed to prove that, but what I can tell you is that we had schooling maybe a couple hours a day. I know we had one certified teacher that taught everybody both history and science. And then there was an uncertified teacher, the headmaster's wife, that taught English, which was pretty minimal. So overall, maybe we had, I would say, 12 hours of schooling a week, maybe. And some of our field trips were considered schooling. We'd look at the trees and identify the leaves and things like that. But when I left the facility, I was far behind in everything. I barely knew how to write a paper, and I was in 10th grade.
If I may, our students follow the same mass curriculum frameworks. We have data to show that they've got educational attainment. We actually do quite well with a very disabled population, particularly in terms of learning disabilities. Most of our children are gaining a year for a year in reading. We're struggling more with math, as the nation is. They have to take the MCAS, which is our state licensing, our state annual exams. So we have to meet all the same criteria. They're on individual educational plans, and we meet with the school district annually to update those.
Okay.
I would add a couple things here for us. We saw some examples of schools that said they were accredited and they weren't, so that's been something out there. And we had one kid in our case study number 5 who was there for 4 years, and he got no education.
And Ms. Brown, did...
From the oversight perspective, I can tell you that in our survey of the states, when we asked about what aspects state agencies monitored, the presence of educational programming and also in particular the quality of educational program were the least likely to be monitored.
Of kind of a cross-section?
Of other things like physical plant, staff issues, use of seclusion and restraint.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Coutts, on your case number 5 on page 15, You write about in the report the interaction between the parents and the placement facility, and you talk about when the victim's father, the victim of this abuse, refused to attend therapy meetings for the fear of losing his job. The program told him to quit. When he would not quit his job or miss work to attend the meetings, the victim said the program convinced his mother to leave her husband. After the parents separated, the program would not allow the victim to contact his father. The victim said the program never told the victim's family that all of the drug tests they performed, and we referred to this earlier, were negative results, including the initial one. I mean, I just don't understand this pattern of therapy where this much trauma can be activated within the family. I don't quite get this. I've never heard of.
It's an incredible story, actually. It was almost like a cult-like organization, and they brainwashed a lot of the parents, it appeared, from what we saw, and they became part of the process. And actually, kids were going home at night sometimes to other people's parents' houses and staying. And there was abuse going on in some cases at other parents' houses. So it was a very bizarre thing, Mr. Chairman, that there's a movie about it. Over the GW, it's called. I mean, it's just an incredible story. And this is one of the ones that accepted Medicaid money. That's how they were primarily funded, millions and millions of dollars for Medicaid. But the parents became kind of sucked into the program, and there were apparently split marriages and things involved because one parent might get sucked in, the other one didn't, and that caused pretty significant issues.
Dr. Valanci, you're...
You know, we have learned a lot about the treatment of mental health disorders for children and youth in this country. There are established evidence-based protocols and practices, largely funded by the federal government. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, National Institutes of Mental Health have funded studies to show what works and what does not. This is absurd that this is being done in the form of, or in the claim of treatment, and to think that federal dollars are being spent in this abuse is unconscionable to me, and certainly not anything that any child psychiatrist, any medical professional, any mental health professional should be condoning or participating in. You know, it's not like we don't know what works. And the fact that we're not utilizing what's known is, I think, the greatest sin.
Thank you. Mr. Coots, you have several times in your testimony this morning used the word torture. We've had some discussion about the use of restraints and, I'm sorry.
Seclusion and restraint.
Seclusion and restraints. Could you comment on this and why you use the word torture?
Yes, I would say two things. Torture would be, for example, in case number 1, where the boy couldn't walk, was having trouble breathing, yet they were forcing him to exercise. They were actually picking him up and dropping him on the ground as a push-up. In other words, he couldn't do a push-up. He was ready to die, and they were picking him up and dropping him on the ground. And I understand the last word he breathed was no. And so that's an incredible case. But you're talking about the human restraint here, too. And we saw human restraint in many forms. The ones that caused the death were typically the face-down restraint. And again, some of those were done contrary even to the program's policies and procedures, where there were either 3 people on top of a child or 1, and one of the boys, in fact, had asthma, and the staff had not been told that, and they did a face-down restraint, and he died. Some of the other restraints were, you know, it was called 3-point, 4-point, 5-point. 3-point being 3 people holding down limbs or the head. The 5-point restraint would have been 1 person on each arm, 1 person on each leg, and 1 person holding the neck or the head still, many times for hours. And so I would say that that's pretty severe abuse bordering on torture. I'm not sure what the distinction is between abuse and torture, but certainly I think that in some of the cases I would define it as torture, what we saw.
I just want to make sure that you weren't casually using the term. You're using it based upon the case studies that you you examined?
Not just the case studies. Other kids in these programs had the same thing done to them.
On page 2 of your long testimony, you explain how you selected these cases. We limited our cases to closed criminal cases, and thus did not include ongoing cases from the last several years. Can you tell us how many ongoing cases there were?
There's a lot, and we actually had more cases we looked at. We didn't include them in the testimony because they had some sort of ongoing litigation, or there may have been some other reason we excluded them. But as I mentioned before, there's other big civil cases with hundreds of plaintiffs involved that are out there right now that have some of the similar types of things we've talked about here, that your two former victims, I will call them, sitting at the table here, have described the same types of things. So there are hundreds of cases out there of individuals involved with these.
That's abuse.
Abuse? Yeah, those are typically abuse because the kids are still alive for that particular civil case.
I don't know if they were families, but what about were there other cases of death?
Yes. Yes, there were other suicides and other types of cases of death, yes.
Can you supplement your testimony for the committee with those numbers?
We can provide other information based on the other cases we have. We don't have any broad numbers, again, as Ms. Brown said. I think there's just no one knows how many, but we can submit other information on what we know, yes.
So these cases were selected from a larger number
Absolutely.
of cases, either of death and or abuse.
Yes, and given another couple of years, we could have used some of those other cases as they became closed,
Sure.
et cetera, yes.
Ms. Brown, very often this Congress has reacted very, very quickly to the question of background checks, certainly around the care of young children, or the teaching of children, people working with children. We have criminal background checks. We're worried about sexual predators. We worry about all those kinds of things. In many cases, we've enacted statutes to require that of states or agencies or various programs. How do these programs fall within those kinds of background checks? In the first round of the hearings, I think in a number of instances, we found very questionable characters working as programs, but no requirements of background checks. I don't know, again, what your survey told you about the background checks, and Mr. Coots has alluded to in a number of cases where students were sexually preyed upon by some element of these programs. What can you tell us about that?
Well, according to what was reported to us, state agencies are saying that they do require background checks when they are funding facilities.
If the facility is required to be licensed by the agency.
Correct.
But if the facility is not required, as a number of these apparently were not, that would not apply.
Correct.
There's no generic state law with respect to that for a business?
There may be some generic state laws. I don't know if we know the full answer to that, but certainly there are facilities that are exclusively private, that are not under the purview of state agencies, that would not be monitored for their background checks. Even if they were required to conduct them, if there was no oversight, no one would know whether they had actually conducted them and what the outcomes were.
Mr. Coots, in any of your interviews that GAO did of prospective programs, was there any discussion about background checks, about staffing?
Yes, and sometimes they had been done, sometimes they hadn't. But remember what we talked about here earlier, a lot of these people were never convicted of anything. So even if you did a fingerprint background check on a lot of these people, they might come up clean, but they could have been involved with the cases of torture and abuse we've been talking about here. But I still would support a fingerprint background check as being one of the potential standards here.
Mr. Platts, do you have any further questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No other questions. Just again, my thanks to each of you for your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, also to echo your sentiments on the abuse that occurs to the youth, the children in these programs, and also the psychological probably ramifications to the parents who are probably in desperate situations seeking what they think is help. And trusting others to be giving assistance, and when instead they're not, and the long-term consequences within the family dynamics of the abuse that occurs in these facilities. I think that's an important aspect of the oversight you're leading and the efforts to reform it. So, again, my thanks for your leadership on the issue.
Thank you. I want to thank you and Ms. McCarthy for all your cooperation and your input in this matter, and look forward to continuing to work with the whole committee on this. And I certainly want to thank GAO for all of your work and tell you how much we appreciate it. I think you've given us a much better idea of the scope of the problem that we're confronting. Some of the difficulties that we're going to have in trying to deal with it, given the patchwork and the creativity, patchwork of regulations and the creativity of some of these organizations. Tragically, you've also given us a pretty good idea of how dangerous and reckless some of these programs are with respect to the students that are in their been assigned their care by their parents, and maybe even more astonishing is almost the predatory nature of some of these programs, and preying on both the students when in their care and preying on these families prior to their surrendering their children to the care of these programs. Again, this is not an indictment of this entire industry, but clearly these reckless and dangerous programs should not be able to hide behind those who are doing the responsible thing with respect to the care of these children, in many instances who are in fact very, very difficult problems, and as Dr. Blasoni pointed out, cannot be cared for in their own homes. They require some other kind of treatment outside of their homes. Ms. Whitehead and Mr. Martin Crawford, thank you very much for publicly coming forward and talking about your experiences, and obviously I think every member of this committee wishes you the best in your continued endeavors. We're quite amazed, given your stories, to see where you are today, and you should be very proud of that. And Dr. Blasoni, thank you for giving us a compass here where we should be thinking about, and some standards what we should be thinking about with respect to the program you're involved in, but also the state's regulation of that kind of program. So thank you all. I'm sure we'll be back in touch with you in rather short order because I think the hearings raised some issues that we want to continue to clarify from both sides of the aisle. But thank you for your cooperation. And with that, the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you.